Hi there. So Asim just told us about the right way to host single-page apps. I'd like to talk about isomorphic apps. Isomorphic apps, you might also know them as universal JavaScript, full-stack JavaScript. Probably heard about server-side rendering. This is not a talk about naming, so for the purpose of this talk, let's just assume they're all the same, and we talk about isomorphic JavaScript apps. What I mean with isomorphic JavaScript apps are single-page apps in the browser that do the initial render on the server. And then when the initial render comes back, the browser takes over. I think they're great because you get fast initial page load, like you do from a traditional server-rendered app, but you also get the interactivity that you get from a single-page app. They also make SEO optimization much, much easier. And importantly, you have no code duplication, so you minimize the development effort. And with a modern front-end stack, these isomorphic apps are actually not that hard to achieve anymore. So when you have React and Redux or similar comparable technologies, it's easily doable. But there's one of the harder things that you need to do is sharing the state between the browser and the server. And I'd like to show you the architecture that we've been using at my company over the last few years. So let's do a super quick refresher how it all works. In a single-page app, it's super easy. The browser talks to the API, that's it, nothing else. In an isomorphic app, you also have a server, typically a Node.js server. And what happens is the browser sends a request to the server, Node.js receives the request, looks at the path, interprets the route, requests the required data from the API, renders the result to HTML, and returns that to the browser. And then on the browser side, we can do the same thing. We can then run the application in the browser. And both parts are running the same code. So the problem that we still have here is that the browser app doesn't know about all the data that the server already retrieved. And so that would mean that the browser app would have to start from scratch again. Luckily, we're using some kind of unidirectional data flow like Redux, and that enables us to serialize the whole application state. And so what you typically do is you JSON stringify the current application state and store that in the page, something like window.initialState. And then on the client side, you can bootstrap the Redux store with that initial state, and you can take off exactly where you left off. So you don't have to re-request any data. It's just from that point onwards that the browser takes over. So this works great for public content. But what happens when you have authentication? What if there are resources that you need to log in for? So in the browser, it's straightforward, right? The user puts in the credentials, the browser sends a request to the API, gets back some kind of authentication token, and now all the requests that we make to the API have that auth information available. But what happens when you do a reload? When you do a reload, you want the server to deliver the initial render. And so somehow, the server also needs to become aware of this authentication information. How do we do this? With cookies, of course. Cookies allow you to store arbitrary data and then transmit that data to any request that you make. So what you could do is you could just store that authentication token that you received, and then when you make a request to the API, you specifically look for that authentication token in your cookie. That works, but I think we can do even better. And here's my suggestion. Why don't you JSON stringify your Redux state into cookies every time the Redux state changes? If you do it this way, you can use that information in the cookie as the initial state for the Redux store on the server, in the very same way that you do in the browser when you take over from the server. Now, why would we do this? I think this has multiple benefits. First of all, you don't need any special treatment anymore. Your authentication information is just part of your application state, like everything else. And it's also more flexible. You can keep track of other things like your position in the checkout flow or whether your user has accepted a cookie notice. So this is the whole concept, the persistence cycle. If you think this is a good idea, you can use this today. There are 2 ways you can do this. I wrote a Redux persist plugin that persists to cookies. And there's also, this concept is also implemented in the Vue starter project, which one of my colleagues developed. Now, we heard about Vue and TypeScript and progressive web apps today. The Vue starter project actually incorporates all these things, so do check it out. It's really useful. I work for a company called BCG Digital Ventures. We're startup builders, so we deliver whole companies as our product, not just software. We've launched 50 ventures over the last few years. I'm hanging around by the BCGDV booth. We have it upstairs, right by the right when you get upstairs. That's it from me. Thanks.
All right. Hello.